In the summer of 1776, the American Revolution should have ended. By every measurable standard of power, experience, and resources, the British Empire held an overwhelming advantage. Britain possessed the most professional army in the world, hardened by decades of European warfare, supported by the strongest navy ever assembled. Its generals had fought campaigns across continents. Its officers were trained in formal strategy. Its soldiers were disciplined, drilled, and supplied in ways the American forces could not match. The American colonies, by contrast, were attempting something unprecedented. Their army was not truly an army at all, but a fragile collection of volunteers. Farmers, craftsmen, laborers, and shopkeepers who had taken up arms with little understanding of what prolonged war demanded. Supplies were inconsistent, training varied wildly, enlistments were short, often lasting only months. Loyalty was shaped as much by local conditions as by ideology. At the center of this fragile experiment stood George Washington. History remembers Washington as a symbol, calm, confident, almost inevitable. A man who seems, in hindsight, destined to lead a nation. But in 1776, Washington was not a legend. He was a commander facing problems no one in America had ever solved before. He was learning while the survival of the rebellion depended on his judgment. Every day brought uncertainty. Intelligence was incomplete. Reports contradicted one another. Advice came from officers with limited experience and from politicians with unrealistic expectations. Washington carried the burden of command in unrealistic expectations. Washington carried the burden of command in isolation, aware that a single mistake could destroy everything. One decision made under that pressure nearly erased the idea of the United States before it could fully exist. This is the story of George Washington's biggest mistake. In June of 1775, George Washington arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to take command of the Continental Army. The title suggested unity and strength. The reality was less impressive. What Washington found was a loose coalition of colonial militias drawn from different colonies, each with its own traditions, officers, and expectations. Discipline was inconsistent. Authority was often questioned. Many soldiers believed they were equals rather than subordinates. Weapons varied widely in quality. Some men carried functional muskets. Others brought hunting rifles unsuitable for formation fighting. Bayonets were scarce. Artillery was limited. Ammunition shortages were so severe that live fire training was often avoided to conserve powder. Food supplies fluctuated. Pay was irregular. Clothing wore out faster than it could be replaced. Disease spread easily through crowded camps. Desertion was common, not always from cowardice, but from exhaustion and disillusionment. Washington immediately recognized that this force could not survive a direct confrontation with Britain's professional army. Not without time, not without discipline, not without experience. The conflict that brought him there had begun earlier, in April of 1775, at Lexington and Concord. Those skirmishes had ignited open fighting, but they had not yet committed the colonies to full independence. Many colonists still hoped for reconciliation. Many still saw themselves as loyal British subjects seeking reform rather than separation. That illusion collapsed in July of 1776. When the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, the nature of the war changed forever. The colonies were no longer protesting British policies. They were rejecting British authority outright. There would be no compromise, no negotiated settlement. Washington understood the significance immediately. Britain would not tolerate defiance. It would respond with overwhelming force. The question was where that force would fall. The answer was New York. New York City occupied a position of immense strategic importance. It was one of the largest cities in the colonies, a vital port connecting Atlantic trade routes. Control of New York meant control of movement, communication, and supply along the eastern seaboard. Politically, abandoning New York without resistance seemed impossible. The Continental Congress expected Washington to defend it. Civilians expected protection. Surrendering such a critical city without a fight could shatter confidence in the revolution before it had time to mature. Washington felt this pressure acutely. He understood that wars were fought not only with armies, but with belief. Morale mattered. Symbols mattered. Losing New York without resistance risked making the revolution appear weak and doomed. Yet, from a military perspective, New York was dangerously exposed. Water surrounded the city on multiple sides. Long Island lay open to amphibious landings. Manhattan stretched north and south, vulnerable along its length. Rivers and harbors provided perfect access points for a navy that dominated the seas. The British fleet could land troops almost anywhere it wished. Once engaged, Washington's army would have limited routes of retreat. A defeat would not remain contained. It could become annihilation. Washington was not blind to these dangers. In his correspondence, he described New York as a post of infinite importance, but also admitted that it could not be easily defended against a superior naval power. Despite his doubts, Washington chose to defend the city. The decision was shaped by political pressure, fear of appearing weak, and the belief that abandoning New York would destroy morale. It was also a gamble that placed the entire Continental Army in the gravest danger it would ever face. In July of 1776, the British arrived. The sight alone was overwhelming. Hundreds of ships filled New York Harbor. Warships, transports, and supply vessels moved with practiced coordination. More than 30,000 British and Hessian troops assembled under the command of General William Howe. It was the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever sent across the Atlantic. For the American soldiers watching from their positions, the psychological impact was devastating. These were not local skirmishers. They were professional soldiers, veterans of European wars, trained to advance under fire, supported by artillery and naval guns. Washington attempted to prepare his forces as best he could. He reinforced fortifications. He repositioned units. He split his army between Manhattan and Long Island in an attempt to guard multiple approaches. Each decision carried trade-offs. Splitting his already inferior force reduced flexibility. Communication between units became slower and less reliable. Coordination suffered. The British waited. They studied American positions. They gathered intelligence. They allowed Washington's anxiety to grow. Time favored them. On August 27, 1776, they struck. Under cover of darkness, British forces executed a wide flanking maneuver through lightly guarded passes on Long Island. American commanders failed to detect the movement in time. When the attack came, it struck from unexpected directions. Defensive lines collapsed rapidly. Units became isolated. Orders failed to reach the front. What began as an organized withdrawal quickly descended into confusion. Washington rode toward the fighting, attempting to restore order. He watched men flee under pressure they had never experienced. He saw officers lose control of their units. He witnessed the collapse of carefully prepared defenses in a matter of hours. By the end of the day, the Continental Army had suffered a devastating defeat. Thousands were dead, wounded, or captured. Survivors were driven back toward Brooklyn Heights. Worse still, the army was trapped. British forces controlled the land approaches. The Royal Navy dominated the surrounding waters. The Continental Army was pressed against the East River with no obvious escape route. By every established rule of warfare, the war was over. A coordinated assault would destroy Washington's army and end the rebellion in a single, decisive blow. But that final blow did not come. General Howe hesitated. Whether from caution, overconfidence, or fear of casualties, he chose to delay. That hesitation changed history. On the night of August 29, 1776, Washington ordered a full evacuation of Long Island. There would be no heroic stand. Survival was the only objective. Rowboats ferried soldiers across the East River in near silence. Cannons were dragged through mud. Horses were led by hand. Wounded men were carried on makeshift stretchers. Any noise risked discovery. Any delay risked disaster. As dawn approached, a thick fog settled over the river. It concealed the final movements of the retreat. When British forces advanced the following morning, they found abandoned positions. The Continental Army was gone. Not a single soldier was left behind. Washington had escaped destruction by inches. The miracle of that night did not undo the damage. New York City soon fell under British control. British forces consolidated their position and expanded operations across the region. In November of 1776, British troops captured Fort Washington, taking more than 2,800 American prisoners in a single blow. It was one of the worst defeats suffered by the Continental Army during the war. Morale collapsed. Enlistments expired. Desertions increased. Confidence in the revolutionary cause weakened. Washington retreated across New Jersey, pursued relentlessly by British forces. At times, his army dwindled to fewer than 5,000 men. Supplies were scarce. Food was limited. Winter approached. Many believed the revolution was finished. Washington himself understood how close he had come to failure. The decision to defend New York had nearly destroyed everything he was trying to protect. But from that failure came clarity. Washington realized that he could not defeat the British in large, traditional battles. Not yet. Victory would not come from holding cities or defending symbolic positions. It would come from keeping the army alive. From that moment forward, Washington changed his approach to war. He avoided decisive engagement whenever possible. He retreated when necessary. He preserved his force even at the cost of territory. The goal was no longer immediate victory. It was survival. In December of 1776, that strategy produced its first reward. On the night of December 25th, Washington led his army across the icy Delaware River. The crossing was brutal, the weather unforgiving. Ice choked the water. Men struggled to keep their footing. On the morning of December 26th, American forces attacked the Hessian garrison at Trenton. The victory was limited in scale, but enormous in effect. Days later, Washington struck again at Princeton. The Continental Army regained confidence. The rebellion endured. Washington's greatest mistake reshaped him into the leader the war required. Not a general who always won, but one who understood endurance. The decision to defend New York nearly destroyed the American Revolution. But from that failure came wisdom. The United States was not born from perfect strategy. It was born from survival against impossible odds. In 1776, America did not win. It endured.